The United States District Court for the District of Columbia buzzed with anticipation on a late March morning in 2025. The courtroom was packed. Lawyers, reporters, witnesses, and spectators filled every seat, their murmurs a constant hum. Karoline Leavitt, White House press secretary, sat in the witness row, her presence a quiet force amid the crowd. She wasn't here to deliver a briefing or field questions from the press corps. Today, she was a key witness in an unprecedented case. Federal Judge Marcus Holloway stood accused of abusing his judicial authority and obstructing justice. Her hands gripped a slim stack of sealed documents, her posture rigid, her eyes steady. Across the room, Holloway's chair sat empty, but his shadow hung heavy. For months, Karoline had tracked the whispers about his rulings from her perch at the White House. A temporary injunction issued without a written order, a case stalled under dubious pretenses, a pattern of decisions that reeked of manipulation. These weren't mistakes, she'd decided, but deliberate acts. When evidence landed in her hands, she'd pushed the Department of Justice to act. Now she was here to face him, not just to testify, but to expose what he'd hidden behind his robe. This wasn't a routine hearing, it was a reckoning. The gavel struck, silencing the room. Judge Judith Klein, presiding over the preliminary hearing, leaned forward, her voice cutting through the tension like a blade. "Today," she said, cold and deliberate, "we examine the allegations against Judge Marcus Holloway. This is no small matter." Every eye locked on her, but Karoline's gaze didn't flinch. She'd seen the reports, heard the rumors. A tech company shielded from DOJ scrutiny, a verbal order with no paper trail, a judge protecting secrets instead of justice. She'd made the call. This couldn't stay buried. Holloway would walk in soon, and when he did, she'd be ready. Klein's words lingered, a warning and a promise. The accusations were grave. Holloway had allegedly twisted his authority to block an investigation into a firm tied to domestic terrorism, issuing an injunction that left the DOJ scrambling. When they'd moved forward anyway, he'd cried foul, claiming defiance of his court. But Karoline knew the truth ran deeper. The documents in her hands, emails, schedules, a damning recording, pointed to a man who didn't just bend the law, but broke it to shield someone powerful. She'd fought to bring this case here, past the skepticism of DOJ brass, past the threats of political fallout. Holloway's entrance was moments away. Karoline tightened her grip on the folder, her jaw set. This wasn't about headlines or her title. It was about trust, about a system teetering on the edge of corruption. She wasn't just a witness. She was the spark that had forced this confrontation. When he took his seat, it wouldn't be a simple exchange of testimony. It would be a battle of wits, truth against power, and Karoline was prepared to win. Marcus Holloway wasn't always the man Karoline Leavitt was waiting to confront in that packed courtroom. Years ago, he'd been a name whispered with respect in legal circles. A Yale law standout, a rising star who'd cut his teeth arguing First Amendment cases with a razor-sharp mind. Appointed to the federal bench by President Trump in 2018, Holloway had built a reputation as a defender of free speech, handing down rulings that won him allies among libertarians and conservatives alike. His chambers were a fortress of precedent, his demeanor polished yet unyielding. But by 2025, that shine had dulled, whispers had turned to suspicions, and Karoline had been listening. The trouble started 3 months earlier, in a closed session buried deep in the court's docket. Holloway had issued a temporary injunction sharpening the scales on written justification, barring the Department of Justice from accessing data held by Veridian Tech, a shadowy cybersecurity firm. The company was under investigation for funneling funds to a domestic terror cell linked to a string of infrastructure attacks. Power grids flickering out in Ohio, water systems failing in Texas. The DOJ had hard evidence, bank records, encrypted chats, a trail leading straight to Veridian's servers. But Holloway's order stopped them cold, delivered in a terse oral statement during a hearing no one outside the room had been allowed to witness. No paper trail, no explanation beyond a vague nod to national security concerns. It was a wall thrown up at the 11th hour, and it didn't sit right. The DOJ pressed forward anyway, raiding Veridian's offices under a narrow legal loophole. Holloway fired back, accusing them of contempt, his voice booming through a press release that painted the government as reckless overreachers. To most, it looked like a jurisdictional spat, judiciary versus executive, the kind of clash that fueled law school debates. But Karoline saw something else. From her office in the White House, she'd been briefed on the case's stakes. Lives lost in those attacks, families still grieving, a threat that hadn't been fully contained. Holloway's move wasn't caution, it was a shield, and she needed to know who he was protecting. The first crack appeared a month later when an envelope arrived on her desk, unmarked and slipped past security. Inside was a note from a former court clerk, someone who'd worked under Holloway until last year. The handwriting was shaky, but the words were clear. He's stalling Viridian to cover for someone big. Check his meetings. No name, no return address, just a lead. Karoline didn't hesitate. She reached out to DOJ contacts, quietly pulling strings to dig deeper. What they found wasn't a smoking gun, not yet, but a pattern that chilled her. Holloway's calendar showed unscheduled gaps, late-night slots at his chambers, off-the-record calls with a Capitol Hill exchange. Emails from his office, recovered from a wiped server, hinted at urgency. Push it back, one read. No filings until I say. Then there was the recording. Grainy, incomplete but unmistakable, Holloway's voice low and clipped on a call with an unknown party. Don't let him dig. I'll handle it. Karoline pieced it together like a puzzle with missing edges. The clerk's tip pointed to a congressional heavyweight tied to Viridian Tech, someone with enough pull to sway a judge, someone who'd sat on oversight committees with access to classified briefings. Holloway wasn't just ruling on a case, he was playing defense, delaying the DOJ long enough for evidence to fade or trails to go cold. The thought gnawed at her. She'd spent years behind podiums, shaping narratives, but this was different. This was a betrayal of trust, a judge wielding his gavel like a gatekeeper. She couldn't let it stand. The decision came in a late-night meeting, the White House briefing room, dim and silent save for a handful of legal advisors. Karoline sat at the table's head, her voice steady despite the hour. "If we don't take this to court," she said, her eyes sweeping the room, "he'll keep burying the truth. Not just this case, every case he touches." The advisors shifted, uneasy. One, a gray-haired counsel named Daniel Pierce, leaned forward. "You're talking about charging a sitting judge, Karoline. The blowback could sink us." She didn't blink. "The blowback's already here. People are dead because of what he's hiding. We move now, or we're complicit." Pierce sighed, but he didn't argue. He had seen the same reports she had. Families shattered, a terror cell still lurking. The room settled into a tense agreement. They'd push the DOJ to act. From that moment, Karoline stepped out, Carrie drenched. In sweat from the March chill, she'd gone from the West Wing's sidelines to the courtroom's front line. She'd traded press briefings for depositions, sound bites for sworn statements. The evidence was thin but damning. Those cryptic emails, the clerk's note, the muffled recording. It wasn't enough to convict on its own, but it was enough to demand answers. Holloway had underestimated her, assuming his robe and reputation would shield him. He didn't know Karoline Leavitt. Not yet. She wasn't here for politics or headlines. She was here for the truth, and she'd drag it into the light piece by piece, no matter the cost. Back in the courtroom, the memory of that meeting fueled her. Holloway's empty chair mocked her patience, but she sat still, the sealed documents heavy in her hands. She'd brought this fight to his doorstep, and when he walked in, she'd be ready. This wasn't just about Viridian Tech or one rogue judge. It was about a system teetering on corruption, and she'd be the one to tip the scales. The courtroom doors swung open and Marcus Holloway entered, his stride measured, his black robe replaced by a charcoal suit that hung sharply on his frame. The murmurs hushed as he took his seat at the defense table, his face a mask of calm, though his eyes flicked briefly toward Karoline Leavitt. She met his gaze without blinking, her fingers still curled around the sealed documents. Judge Judith Klein's gavel struck again, signaling the start of the preliminary hearing. "We begin," Klein said, her tone as unyielding as stone. "Counsel for the United States, proceed." Aaron Stokes, the DOJ's lead attorney, rose from his chair, his broad shoulders squared. A veteran of high-stakes prosecutions, he carried the weight of the government's case with a quiet intensity. "Your Honor," he began, his voice steady, We charge Judge Marcus Holloway with abusing his judicial authority and obstructing justice under Title 18 of the United States Code, Section 1503. 3 months ago, he issued an injunction against the Department of Justice, halting our access to critical data from Viridian Tech, a company linked to domestic terrorism. This order came with no written record, no legal grounding beyond a verbal assertion in a closed hearing. It was not a ruling, it was a barricade. Stokes stepped forward, holding up a single sheet of paper. This email, recovered from Holloway's wiped server, proves intent. Sent to his clerk 2 days before our investigation team sought a warrant. It reads, "Keep the files under wraps until I review them." This wasn't oversight or discretion. It was a deliberate act to shield evidence from lawful scrutiny. Holloway didn't just overstep his bench, he weaponized it. The room stirred, reporters scribbling furiously as Stokes laid the foundation of the DOJ's case, a judge who'd twisted his authority into a tool of obstruction. Ellen Carver, Holloway's lead counsel, stood to respond, her silver hair pulled tight, her voice crisp with defiance. A former federal prosecutor turned defense powerhouse, she was Holloway's shield in this storm. "Your Honor," she said, "this is nothing but a politically motivated assault on judicial independence." Judge Holloway's injunction was a lawful exercise of his discretion, rooted in the inherent powers of the bench to protect national security interests. The DOJ's rash actions, proceeding with their raid despite his order, show contempt for the judiciary, not the other way around. She turned to Stokes, her eyes narrowing. "They bring us an email with no context and call it proof. This case lacks direct evidence of misconduct. We move to dismiss." Klein's expression didn't shift, her pen poised over her notes. "Motion noted," she said, "but we'll hear the evidence first. Miss Leavitt, you're called." Karoline rose, her movements deliberate, and crossed to the witness stand. She swore the oath, her voice clear, then sat, facing the room. Stokes approached. "Ms. Leavitt," he began, "you've reviewed materials pertinent to this case. What did you find?" Karoline leaned forward slightly, her tone calm but edged with steel. "I found a recording," she said, nodding as Stokes produced a small audio device. He pressed play and Holloway's voice crackled through the speakers, low and clipped. "Don't let them dig. I'll lock it down." The words hung in the air, sharp and damning. "This was passed to me by a source, a former clerk," Karoline continued. "It's Holloway speaking, days before his injunction stopped the DOJ. He's not discussing legal nuance or security risks. He's promising to bury something. This isn't a mistake or a misjudgment. It's a calculated move to hide the truth, a violation of the transparency every judge swears to uphold." She kept her eyes on Stokes, but her words were aimed at Holloway, each one a blade meant to cut through his defenses. The courtroom buzzed, the weight of her testimony sinking in. Carver shot to her feet, her objections swift. "Your Honor, this recording is inadmissible speculation. There's no timestamp, no metadata to verify when or where it was made. It could be a fragment, a fabrication, anything. Ms. Leavitt's interpretation is just that, an interpretation, not evidence." She turned to Karoline, her tone biting. "You're not a lawyer, Ms. Leavitt. You're a press secretary spinning a narrative. What qualifies you to judge intent?" Holloway shifted in his seat, the faintest smirk tugging at his lips, a flicker of confidence, a belief he'd slipped through this net. Karoline didn't flinch. "I'm not here to judge intent," she said, her voice unwavering. "I'm here to present what I found, what the DOJ verified. That recording aligns with the timeline. Holloway's injunction came 3 days after Viridian Tech's servers were flagged. The email Stokes showed matches the same window. I don't need a law degree to see a pattern. Orders with no record, files held back, a judge telling someone to keep quiet. You don't lock something down unless there's something to hide." Her gaze shifted to Holloway, steady and unrelenting, daring him to meet it. He didn't. Oh. Klein raised a hand, silencing the room. "I'll allow the recording for now," she ruled. "We'll assess its weight as we proceed. Mr. Stokes, continue." Stokes nodded, stepping back to his table, but Carver wasn't done. She approached Karoline, her approach predatory. "You claim this is a pattern," she said. "But you've brought us scraps, a vague email, a fuzzy audio clip. Where's the proof Holloway knew what Viridian Tech was hiding? Where's the link to any crime?" She leaned in, her voice dropping. Or is this just White House theater, a stunt to smear a judge who dared defy you? Karoline held her ground. The proof is in his actions, she said. He didn't rule on evidence. He ruled to stop evidence from being seen. A judge's job is to weigh facts, not bury them. That email wasn't vague. It was a directive. The recording wasn't fuzzy. It was Holloway's voice. And the injunction? It wasn't defiance. It was delay. Viridian Tech's data tied a terror cell to funding. People died because that cell wasn't stopped. If he didn't know, why hide it? If he did, why protect it? Her words landed like blows, each one stripping away Carver's veneer of doubt. Holloway's smirk faded, his fingers tightening on the table. Carver stepped back, her jaw set, but she had no immediate retort. Stokes seized the moment. "Your Honor," he said. "Ms. Leavitt's testimony establishes intent. Holloway didn't act in a vacuum. He acted to obstruct. We'll show more. Schedules, witnesses, a trail he couldn't erase." Klein nodded, her pen scratching across her pad. "Proceed," she said. Karoline returned to her seat, her pulse steady despite the heat of the exchange. Holloway's glance darted her way, brief but loaded. Not with arrogance now, but with something closer to unease. Carver's counter had landed a hit, questioning the recording's strength, but Karoline had anticipated that. She'd prepared for this dance, and the real moves were still to come. The courtroom settled, the air thick with the promise of what lay ahead, a fight not just of law, but of wills, and she was far from finished. The courtroom simmered with tension as Aaron Stokes returned to his table, his opening salvo still echoing in the air. Karoline Leavitt sat back in the witness row, her hands resting lightly on the sealed folder, her mind racing through the next move. Ellen Carver's challenge had landed a blow. Questioning the recording's authenticity had sown a seed of doubt, but Karoline wasn't shaken. She'd anticipated the defense's play, and she'd kept her ace hidden. Holloway sat at his table, his fingers steepled, his calm facade intact, but Karoline could sense the cracks forming. The hearing was teetering on a knife's edge, and she was about to tip it. Stokes turned to Judge Judith Klein, his voice firm. "Your Honor, we request a new witness. Ethan Cole, former legal assistant to Judge Holloway." A ripple of surprise ran through the room. Holloway's head snapped up, his eyes narrowing, while Carver shot to her feet. "Objection," she snapped. "This is ambush litigation. The defense wasn't notified of this witness." Stokes didn't flinch. "Mr. Cole came forward late last night with critical evidence. We informed the court as soon as possible." Klein's gaze shifted between them, her expression unreadable. "I'll hear him," she said. "Bring him in." Ethan Cole entered, a wiry man in his 30s, his suit slightly rumpled, his steps hesitant but resolute. He took the stand, swore the oath, and faced Stokes. "Mr. Cole," Stokes began, "you worked for Judge Holloway until 6 months ago. What did you see?" Cole swallowed, his voice low but clear. "I was his assistant for 2 years. Last summer he told me to destroy records from a closed Viridian Tech hearing. Transcripts, notes, everything. He said it was sensitive and couldn't stay on file." Stokes held up a printout. "Is this the email he sent you?" Cole nodded. "Yes. It says, 'Huino truoctuhai, Marcus.'" I kept a backup. Didn't feel right to erase it completely. The courtroom buzzed, reporters scribbling as Stokes handed the email to Klein. "This was sent 4 days before Holloway's injunction stopped our investigation," he said. "It's not just obstruction, it's erasure of evidence." Carver leapt up, her tones sharp. "Your Honor, Mr. Cole is a disgruntled ex-employee with an axe to grind. He resigned under pressure, his words unreliable." She turned to Cole. "You were disciplined for missing deadlines, weren't you? This is payback." Cole shook his head. "I left because I couldn't keep covering for him. That email's real. I've got the server log to prove it." Klein waved a hand. "Enough. I'll weigh his credibility. Miss Leavitt, you're recalled." Karoline stood, returning to the stand, her posture steady. Stokes approached. "Ms. Leavitt, you've seen Holloway's schedule. Anything stand out?" Karoline nodded, her voice cutting through the room. A day before the injunction, Holloway had an unlogged meeting with Viridian Tech's CEO, Richard Lang. No record, no minutes, just a gap in his calendar, confirmed by his clerk's notes. If this was a fair ruling, why the secrecy? Why meet the man whose company he'd shield the next day? She locked eyes with Holloway, her words a quiet challenge. Carver pounced. "Speculation," she said. "Judges meet people all the time. There's no proof this was about Viridian. You're stitching a story from threads, Ms. Leavitt." Karoline didn't waver. "It's not a story. It's a pattern. An unlogged meeting, a deleted email, a verbal injunction with no basis. Holloway didn't rule on law, he ruled to protect someone. If it's coincidence, let him explain it." Holloway's jaw tightened, but he stayed silent, his fingers gripping the table harder. The room held its breath as Stokes stepped forward, holding a new document. "Your Honor, we have one more piece," he said, his voice low but commanding. "A telegram message, recovered from Viridian Tech's servers, sent to a number tied to Holloway's office. It reads, Cam on M. Da Antoine, sent 30 minutes after his injunction took effect." He paused, letting the words sink in. Translated, it's, "Thank you, M, it's safe." M for Marcus, this isn't coincidence, it's confirmed. The courtroom erupted, gasps and whispers colliding as Stokes handed the printout to Klein. Holloway's face drained of color, his calm shattering for the first time. His hands dropped to his lap, his shoulders slumping as if the weight of the message had physically struck him. Carver scrambled to her feet. "Objection! This is unverified. Anyone could have sent that." "There's no direct link to my client," Stokes countered, unflinching. "The number traces to his office line used only by him and his staff. We have metadata. Date, time, IP address, it's his." Klein raised a hand, silencing the chaos. "I'll review it," she said, her tone clipped. "We're recessed until tomorrow. I need to see this in chambers." The gavel fell, and the room exploded into noise, reporters shouting questions, lawyers conferring in hushed tones. Holloway stood, his movements stiff, and followed his team out, avoiding Karoline's gaze. She remained seated, her eyes fixed on the spot where he'd been, her pulse steady despite the storm around her. She'd pushed him to the wall, and she knew it. Cole's testimony had cracked the foundation, the telegram message had blown it wide open. Holloway's mask of judicial propriety was slipping, and she'd made sure everyone saw it. Stokes approached her as the crowd thinned, his voice quiet. "You held your own up there. That meeting detail, it's what sold it." Karoline nodded, her expression unchanging. "It's not about selling it, it's about proving it. He thought he could outmaneuver us." Stokes gave a tight smile. "He's not out yet. Carver's good. She'll fight the message's admissibility." Karoline's eyes hardened. "Let her try. We've got more than she thinks." Back at the defense table, Carver huddled with her team, her face set in determination. She'd underestimated Karoline, assumed a press secretary couldn't play this game. But Karoline wasn't playing, she was fighting, and she'd brought the kind of evidence that didn't bend to rhetoric. The telegram message wasn't just a thread, it was a noose, and Holloway felt it tightening. His earlier smirk was gone, replaced by a flicker of something raw, fear, perhaps, or the dawning realization that his bench couldn't shield him anymore. Klein's recess gave both sides a moment to regroup, but Karoline didn't need it. She'd walked into this courtroom with a plan, and every step had landed where she'd aimed. Cole's email had turned suspicion into substance. Her spotlight on the meeting had turned substance into motive, and Stokes's message had turned motive into guilt. Holloway had ruled from the shadows for too long, and now the light was on him. She'd forced his hand, and tomorrow, when Klein ruled on the evidence, the real fallout would begin. As the room emptied, Karoline stayed, her gaze lingering on the judge's bench. This wasn't about vengeance or headlines. It was about accountability, about a system that couldn't survive if men like Holloway bent it to their will. She'd flipped the board, and Holloway was cornered. The next move was Klein's, but Karoline knew one thing. She'd made sure he couldn't run. 3 days after the recess, the courtroom was quieter, the frenetic energy of the hearing replaced by a heavy stillness. Judge Judith Klein returned to the bench, her face etched with the weight of her deliberation. The gallery held its breath as she adjusted her glasses and began. "After review," she said, her voice steady, "this court finds Marcus Holloway guilty of obstructing justice under Title 18, Section 1503, and abusing his judicial authority. The evidence, emails, testimony, and the telegram message shows a clear intent to impede a lawful investigation." She paused, her gaze stripped of his judgeship, barred from legal practice and referred for further review of past ruling. The gavel fell, a sharp crack sealing his fate. Holloway sat motionless, his hands folded, his eyes fixed on the table. No outburst, no plea, just silence. When he stood, it was with the stiffness of a man already retreating from the world he'd once ruled. He exited through a side door, flanked by his attorneys, avoiding the crowd that lingered beyond the courtroom walls. Karoline Leavitt watched him go, her expression unchanged, the sealed folder now resting lightly in her lap. She'd won, but there was no triumph in her eyes, only resolve. The verdict rippled far beyond that room. The legal world reeled. Judges who'd once moved with unchecked confidence now faced sharper scrutiny. Within weeks, the DOJ announced a new oversight committee to audit judicial transparency, a direct response to Holloway's fall. The public, long detached from courtroom dramas, turned their attention to the system, poring over updates, questioning what else lay hidden. Holloway's case wasn't just a scandal, it was a fracture, exposing flaws that demanded repair. Karoline stepped outside the courthouse, the late March sun casting a pale glow over Washington, D.C. She paused on the steps, the city's hum faint around her, and whispered to herself, "Justice isn't victory, it's truth laid bare." She'd paid a price for this, her name now a lightning rod, her role at the White House shadowed by accusations of overreach. Critics called her reckless. Allies hailed her as fearless. She didn't care. The cost was hers to bear, and she carried it without regret. Days later, in a small room at Georgetown Law, Karoline faced a group of young attorneys, their notebooks open, their eyes wide. She stood without notes, her voice calm but piercing. "Don't fear the argument," she said. "Fear the silence." The words landed, simple yet profound, and spread, quoted in blogs, etched into memory. They became a spark, lighting a path for those willing to challenge power cloaked in shadow. Holloway was gone, but Karoline's fight had reshaped the ground he'd left behind. She'd traded comfort for clarity, and in that exchange, she'd reminded a nation that justice, however bruised, could still stand.